The lake was practically a graveyard now, a sun-bleached pit where my fishing boat once floated. Cops were cuffing the HOA president, while two biologists in hazmat suits sifted through the cracked mud, shaking their heads. Somewhere under the chaos, endangered fish gasped for air, or what was left of it. Freeze frame. Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I ended up dragging an entire HOA board into federal court and putting half of them on the path to jail. When I first moved to Cedar Hollow Lake, I thought I had found my slice of paradise. After 30 years grinding through corporate law in the city, clawing my way up through the stress and fluorescent lights, I had earned this peace. My property stretched down a gentle slope to the water's edge, framed by ancient cypress trees, where their gnarled roots disappeared into the clear shallows. The lake was a perfect mirror most mornings, broken only by the occasional heron stalking breakfast or the ripple of a fish rising for a bug. The best part was that the deed clearly stated the facts. Half of the lake was mine, in all legal sense of the word, while the other half belonged to the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association. I was fine with the split. Shared spaces never bothered me, especially when my side of the lake saw the best sunrises and the best bass. At first, the neighbors welcomed me. We hosted casual weekend fish fries, where I taught the neighborhood kids how to clean a trout and spin tales of the one that got away. I was the retired lawyer turned friendly fisherman, a novelty among a crowd mostly made up of tech workers and finance people escaping the city grind. Things felt right, or at least they did for the first few months. The first passive-aggressive signs of trouble started as a trickle. I would get these little emails from the Cedar Hollow HOA, full of syrupy language about concerns raised regarding unpermitted water use and unauthorized environmental impact activities. The tone was always careful, polished, but the meaning was clear as ice on a pond. They were not happy that I was enjoying the lake as something alive, instead of treating it like some backdrop for a realtor's photo shoot. I ignored the emails at first. Fishing was a listed permitted activity in the HOA covenants, and nothing in those glossy PDFs said I needed permission to cast a line off my own dock. So, I kept hosting fish fries. I kept inviting kids over to skip stones. I kept believing that reason would prevail. It always had in courtrooms and boardrooms. Why not here? Then, one morning, I woke up early, ready for a lazy Saturday of coffee on the porch and a slow ride across the water in my John boat, only to find the lake hissing like a wounded animal. Giant diesel pumps had been set up overnight on the HOA side of the lake, belching smoke into the sky and dragging water out through wide industrial hoses that snaked across the manicured lawns and into waiting tanker trucks. The sound was deafening, mechanical, a brutal assault on the serenity that had drawn me here. I stood barefoot in the dewy grass, staring in disbelief as I watched the waterline drop, inch by inch. I grabbed my phone and started recording immediately, narrating the date, time, and what I was seeing. Years in litigation taught me the value of evidence. As I stormed down to the pumps, camera still rolling, I saw Linda Bowman, the HOA president, standing with her arms folded, sunglasses perched on her nose, overseeing the whole operation like some petty general waging war on a pond. Linda was the type of person you could spot a mile away. She had the posture of someone who always thought she was the smartest person in the room, even when she clearly was not. Her white polo shirt bore the Cedar Hollow HOA logo in bold blue embroidery, and she wore it like a badge of authority. "What is going on here?" I demanded, keeping my voice steady but firm. Linda turned, giving me a tight, toothy smile. "Routine mosquito control," she said smoothly, as if the roaring of those pumps was just another morning symphony. "I did not approve this," I said. "This lake is half mine. You cannot do this without my permission." She shifted her weight onto one hip, clearly annoyed. "The board voted," she said, as if that explained anything. "For community safety, we deemed it necessary." I pointed toward the lake, where the water line had already receded several feet, exposing cracked mud and stranding fish in rapidly shrinking puddles. "Community safety does not trump property rights or environmental law," I said. "You are draining an ecosystem, not a birdbath." Linda waved a hand dismissively, turning back to confer with one of the workers. I kept recording, documenting every pump, every hose, every tanker. I took shots of the fish flopping helplessly in the drying mud. I took shots of the cranes, startled from their nests, circling high overhead. I was not going to let this go quietly. As I made my way back up to my house, one of my neighbors, an older gentleman named Harold who had lived in the neighborhood since before the HOA even existed, pulled me aside. Harold wore a battered fishing hat and spoke in a low, conspiratorial whisper. "They voted in secret last week," he said. "No public notice, no posted agenda, just decided they wanted the lake gone. Too messy, too hard to maintain. They are planning some big landscaping project, maybe a gazebo, maybe a reflection pool." My stomach turned. Aesthetic landscaping. That is what they were trading this living, breathing ecosystem for. I thanked Harold and went straight to work. I spent the next 2 days digging through public records, scrolling through county databases and property permits until my eyes burned. What I found was worse than I expected. No permits had been filed for water removal. No environmental impact surveys were conducted. No mosquito control plan had been approved by the county health department, which was a mandatory step for any body of water larger than a retention pond. The Cedar Hollow HOA had decided, in their infinite arrogance, that they could just do whatever they wanted and deal with the consequences later. But the consequences were already happening. As the lakebed dried, I found something that turned my anger into outright fury. Among the stranded fish, as I tried to salvage what I could with buckets and frantic trips to deeper puddles, I found several small, wriggling creatures I immediately recognized from a nature magazine I had read years ago. The speckled darter, an endangered species in our state, protected under both federal and local environmental law. I scooped them carefully into a bucket and called the state environmental department before I even washed the mud off my hands. When the officer on the other end of the line heard what I described, his tone shifted from casual to clipped and urgent. "Do not touch anything else," he instructed me. "Document everything. Take samples if you can, but leave the site as intact as possible. Someone will be there within the hour." As I waited, standing knee-deep in what was left of my lake, I looked around and realized the full scope of the damage. This was not just a property dispute anymore. This was a crime scene. Linda Bowman and her army of rule-happy board members had crossed a line so deeply entrenched in law that even their fancy lawyers would not be able to spin their way out of it. And me? I was going to make sure they paid for every fish, every turtle, every blade of grass they destroyed. The trucks kept coming, pumping away, oblivious to the tidal wave heading right for them. In the distance, Linda barked orders, her voice carrying across the gutted lakebed like the squawk of a crow over a carcass. I stood there, muddy and furious, phone still recording, as the first squad car pulled up to the edge of my property, its lights flashing silently against the gray morning mist. The officer stepped out, surveying the scene, his expression hardening as he took in the pumps, the tanker trucks, the devastated shoreline. I knew then, deep in my gut, that this was just the beginning. Cedar Hollow thought they could drain away my rights with the water. They thought wrong. By the time the state environmental department officer arrived, I had already filled half a memory card with photos and videos. The officer, a no-nonsense woman named Karen Mathis, took one look at the half-drained lake, the sputtering pumps, and the writhing fish stranded in the mud and immediately called for backup. She paced the shoreline, snapping pictures and taking notes, while I pointed out the areas where the speckled darters and small-toothed minnows, another threatened species, were clustered. Karen whistled low under her breath and muttered, "They are going to have a real bad day once federal agents get here." Those words felt like a balm to my burning frustration. I gave her copies of my property deeds, showing my legal ownership of half the lake, and detailed everything I had documented so far. Within 2 hours, 2 additional SUVs from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service rolled onto my property, agents in khaki uniforms and mirrored sunglasses stepping out with official equipment cases. They fanned out across the shrinking lake, setting up triage stations for the endangered fish and securing samples for forensic evidence. The word spread faster than I could have imagined. By Monday morning, the local news trucks were parked along the street, antennas raised high, and reporters standing in the early mist rehearsing their lines. Cedar Hollow Lake Massacre, one of them called it, before going live with a dramatic pan of the dying shoreline. Suburban OA drains protected habitat flashed across TV screens, sandwiched between weather reports and stock market updates. I watched from my porch, sipping coffee that tasted far sweeter than usual, as a camera crew interviewed Karen Mathis down by the water's edge. She did not mince words. "This appears to be a significant violation of the Endangered Species Act," she said crisply into the microphone, "and those responsible will be held accountable under state and federal law." Somewhere behind the reporters, I caught sight of Linda Bowman and a few board members huddled together, their faces pale and tight. Linda spotted me watching and shot me a look that could have curdled fresh milk. The HOA wasted no time trying to spin the narrative. By Wednesday, a bright yellow envelope was slapped onto my front door, full of legalese and bluster. It accused me of unauthorized interference with community property, warned of daily fines up to $500 for every day I refused to cease and desist, and threatened further action if I continued to obstruct HOA activities. I laughed out loud when I read it, filing it neatly into a growing binder labeled Evidence, Cedar Hollow HOA Crimes. I had dealt with more sophisticated bullies in courtrooms for decades. These amateurs did not scare me. They should have known better than to poke a bear with a law degree and nothing but time on his hands. Behind the scenes, the HOA escalated their smear campaign. Flyers started appearing in mailboxes, warning residents about my disruptive behavior and accusing me of creating a hostile environment. They sent out carefully worded email blasts, full of weasel words about community standards and the need to maintain a positive neighborhood atmosphere. They even held a so-called informational meeting about lake maintenance and safety, conveniently scheduling it for a day and time when they knew I had a pre-scheduled deposition with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Neighbors I had once fished with began avoiding eye contact when they drove past. Some whispered among themselves at the mailbox cluster. Others stopped waving altogether. Still, I remained calm. Every flyer was photographed. Every email was saved. Every suspicious meeting was logged. I treated the HOA's desperate tactics like a deposition, noting every misstep, every inconsistency, every attempt to bury the truth. I printed off the original property surveys, highlighting my half-ownership in bright neon pink. I cataloged the timestamps on my videos, cross-referencing them with weather records and police reports. I even had Harold write and notarize a witness statement about what he had seen and heard on the day the pumps first arrived. Then, like a gift wrapped in gold foil, came the leak. An anonymous email landed in my inbox late one night, sent through an encrypted service. It contained a thread of internal HOA board emails that made my jaw drop. The board had been joking about the whole thing, making snide comments about flushing out the fish problem and finally turning that swamp into something pretty. One particularly incriminating message from Linda Bowman herself said, "Just think. No more slimy critters for the kids to trip over." She ended it with a smiley face emoji. I forwarded the entire chain to the Fish and Wildlife Service investigators and to Karen Mathis at the State Department, attaching a simple note, "See attached evidence of intent." Public pressure started to mount. Environmental groups caught wind of the story and began flooding social media with calls for action. A Change.org petition demanding the arrest of the HOA board members quickly gathered over 50,000 signatures. People who had never heard of Cedar Hollow before were now tweeting photos of the dying lake under hashtags like Save the Hollow and HOA Disaster. It became clear that the HOA could not contain the disaster they had unleashed, so they called an emergency town hall meeting. The announcement landed in my mailbox with all the false cheerfulness of a foreclosure notice. Community meeting. Important updates about Cedar Hollow Lake. Refreshments provided. I knew exactly what they intended. They wanted to control the narrative, frame themselves as victims of misinformation, and paint me as the villain dragging down property values. What they did not know was that I had no intention of standing alone at that meeting. I contacted an environmental law firm downtown, one that specialized in property rights and conservation litigation. I explained the situation, handed them the evidence, and secured the services of attorney Rebecca Hastings, a sharp-witted woman who had taken down bigger fish than a suburban HOA. When Rebecca walked into the town hall that night, wearing a tailored navy suit and carrying a leather portfolio thicker than a law school textbook, the temperature in the room dropped a solid 10 degrees. Neighbors filled the folding chairs, their expressions a mix of curiosity, concern, and fear. Linda Bowman perched at the front of the room, flanked by the remaining board members, her makeup immaculate, her expression frozen somewhere between a smile and a grimace. She opened with a speech dripping with false humility about how the HOA had only acted in the best interests of community health and safety. She invoked buzzwords like responsibility, vigilance, and stewardship so many times it felt like a drinking game. When she finally asked for community feedback, I stood up, not alone either. Rebecca rose beside me, cool and composed, her voice slicing through the awkward silence like a scalpel. My client would like to address several serious legal concerns regarding the recent activities undertaken by this HOA, she said, handing Linda Bowman a thick packet of documents. Included in this packet, Rebecca continued, are copies of all communications pertaining to the unauthorized drainage of Cedar Hollow Lake, documentation of federally protected species found on the site, and evidence suggesting willful neglect of mandatory permitting processes. Rebecca smiled sweetly as she leaned forward and added, additionally, we have provided copies to the State Environmental Department, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and relevant media outlets. You could have heard a pin drop. Linda's hand trembled slightly as she fumbled through the papers, her face draining of color. One of the board members tried to stand in protest, but Rebecca cut him off smoothly. Further discussion is not recommended at this time, pending the outcome of ongoing investigations, she said. Meanwhile, several neighbors who had once avoided me now leaned forward eagerly, whispering and snapping photos of the scene unfolding before them. By the time the meeting adjourned, it was clear the tides had shifted. The HOA had underestimated me badly. They thought they were fighting a cranky retiree with a fishing hobby. Instead, they had picked a fight with someone who knew the rules of engagement better than they did, someone who would not stop until justice rolled through Cedar Hollow like a freight train. And from the looks on their faces as they scurried out of the town hall that night, they knew it too. It did not take long for the full weight of the federal government to land squarely on Cedar Hollow. Less than a week after the emergency town hall, unmarked black SUVs rolled through the front gates of the HOA office complex just after dawn, their tinted windows gleaming under the early morning sun. From my porch, coffee in hand, I watched the drama unfold like the opening act of a courtroom thriller. Agents from the Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Attorney's Office poured out, their jackets flashing bold yellow letters, their hands full of thick legal folders and bright orange evidence tags. Within minutes, the HOA office doors were swinging open and shut as agents carted out computers, filing cabinets, and boxes full of records. Word traveled fast through our little lakeside community. Subpoenas had been served, offices had been searched, phone records had been seized. The investigation was no longer a quiet backroom affair. It was a full-blown federal case now, and the HOA board members knew it. By noon, the first resignations started trickling in. The HOA treasurer, a squirrely man named Barry Hastings, who always wore a bow tie too tight for his neck, was the first to fall. His resignation email, leaked by a sympathetic HOA secretary, was nothing short of a full-scale retreat. Personal reasons, he claimed. But the panic was obvious between the lines. By evening, 2 more board members had jumped ship, each citing health concerns and the desire to spend more time with family. The once proud HOA leadership, which had boasted about enforcing community standards and property values, was crumbling faster than a sandcastle at high tide. But the real bombshell dropped 3 days later. Investigators revealed that Linda Bowman herself had falsified permit applications related to the drainage project. documents signed under penalty of perjury, had claimed, with bold confidence, that no endangered species inhabited the lake. They had lied straight to the faces of county officials, state regulators, and even federal agencies. Copies of the forged forms were splashed across every major news outlet in the region. Headlines screamed about the scandal. HOA president accused of federal fraud. Protected habitat destroyed in HOA power grab. It was a feeding frenzy, and for once I was glad to see the media digging their teeth in and refusing to let go. The fallout continued to escalate. Cedar Hollow's HOA insurance company, faced with the mountain of evidence and the very real prospect of criminal convictions, sent a curt letter to the remaining board members. Due to exclusions in the policy regarding criminal acts and intentional misconduct, the insurance company would not be covering legal fees or settlements related to the lake incident. Translation: the HOA was on its own, no backup, no safety net. Every penny spent on defense attorneys, court costs, and potential judgments would come directly from the pockets of the HOA members themselves. Panic spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Emergency meetings were called. Special assessments were whispered about. Homeowners who had once ignored my warnings now found themselves staring down the barrel of $1,000 special fees to cover the sins of Linda Bowman and her cronies. I was not about to let the matter rest with criminal charges alone. The destruction of my half of the lake, the loss of use, the damage to the fragile ecosystem I had cherished, it all demanded restitution. I filed a civil lawsuit against the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association, naming Linda Bowman and the board members individually as well. Property destruction, environmental negligence, loss of quiet enjoyment. I calculated every fish lost, every tree damaged, every moment stolen from me when the pumps drained away more than just water. Rebecca Hastings, my environmental attorney, filed the paperwork with a flourish, adding a personal injury claim for the emotional distress caused by the relentless HOA harassment campaign. We asked for a sum that would make even the most stubborn insurance adjuster gulp. And the best part? Since the HOA's insurance had abandoned them, the board members were personally exposed. Their homes, their bank accounts, their retirement funds, all fair game. As my lawsuit gained traction, smaller claims started stacking up like a game of legal Jenga ready to topple. Other neighbors, emboldened by the federal investigation and the public shaming of the board, filed their own suits. Harold sued for trespass and environmental damage. The Thompsons sued for destruction of property after their kid's favorite fishing spot was ruined. Even quiet Mrs. Langston from 3 houses down filed a claim for emotional distress, citing the loss of wildlife she had loved photographing in her retirement. The lawsuits came from all directions, a tidal wave of accountability that even Linda's best spin doctors could not contain. Facing mounting legal fees and public humiliation, Linda Bowman and her second-in-command, Vice President Greg Alston, tried a desperate gambit. They blamed the landscaping contractor who had been hired to manage the mosquito control project. According to hastily issued statements, it was the contractor's fault that permits were not properly filed. It was the contractor's decision to drain the lake without verifying the environmental impact. It was the contractor, they insisted, who misled the board into believing that the operation was legal. It was a clumsy, transparent attempt to shift blame, and no one with a working brain cell believed it. Unfortunately for Linda and Greg, the landscaping contractor had no intention of going down quietly. The owner of Green Horizons Landscaping, a gruff, no-nonsense man named Carlos Ramirez, quickly lawyered up and went public with his side of the story. In a press conference held on the steps of the county courthouse, Carlos revealed that he had been explicitly instructed by the HOA board to drain the lake as quickly and quietly as possible. He produced emails and text messages from Linda Bowman herself, messages that left no room for doubt. One particularly damning text from Linda read, "Get it done fast before anyone has time to make a stink. No need to tell the tree huggers about the fish." Another email chain showed the board joking about Carlos being their scapegoat if things went south. Carlos provided copies of every communication to federal investigators, effectively cutting the legs out from under Linda's defense strategy. His cooperation not only exonerated his company but further implicated the HOA board in a conspiracy to willfully violate environmental laws for their own aesthetic preferences. The Department of Justice quietly amended the federal charges against Linda and Greg to include conspiracy to commit fraud and obstruction of justice. The noose was tightening fast, and they knew it. Meanwhile, the community continued to implode. Homeowners screamed at board meetings, demanding resignations, refunds, and explanations. For sale signs popped up on manicured lawns like weeds after a rainstorm. Property values plummeted as the neighborhood's name became synonymous with scandal. Realtors began whispering warnings to potential buyers, telling them to steer clear of the disaster zone known as Cedar Hollow. In the middle of it all, I stayed calm. I kept documenting. I kept meeting with attorneys and investigators. I kept reminding anyone who asked that I had only ever wanted to fish quietly off my dock and enjoy the lake I partly owned. It was the HOA's greed and arrogance that had turned this peaceful place into a battleground. And now, justice was not just coming, it was already here, grinding forward with the slow, unstoppable momentum of a landslide. Linda Bowman, who had once ruled the HOA meetings with a smug smile and a gavel, now appeared in court wearing a cheap suit and a face drained of color. Greg Alston, the man who once bragged about his leadership experience in the HOA newsletter, spent more time whispering with his defense attorney than looking anyone in the eye. Their empire of manicured lawns and ridiculous regulations had crumbled into mud and subpoenas, and no amount of community newsletters could put it back together again. And me? I was just getting started. Justice, when it finally arrived, did not knock politely on Cedar Hollow's door. It kicked the door clean off its hinges. In a coordinated operation between the State Environmental Department, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the U.S. Attorney's Office, federal agents descended on the neighborhood at sunrise, one crisp October morning. Neighbors watched from their porches, coffee mugs forgotten in trembling hands, as black SUVs and unmarked sedans surrounded Linda Bowman's grand two-story house at the top of Cedar Ridge Drive. She emerged in handcuffs, wearing a wrinkled pink bathrobe and house slippers, her hair tangled and wild, a far cry from the perfectly polished woman who used to strut through HOA meetings like a queen holding court. Alongside her, Greg Alston and another board member, Susan Myers, were also led away, faces pale and eyes vacant, as camera crews jostled for the best angle. The charges were read aloud by the U.S. Attorney during a midday press conference: felony environmental destruction, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and falsification of federal documents. Combined, they faced decades behind bars and millions in personal fines. The news spread like a prairie fire. Local newspapers ran screaming headlines. National outlets picked up the story. Environmental advocacy groups hailed the arrests as a landmark victory against suburban overreach and bureaucratic arrogance. Social media exploded with memes, GIFs, and hashtags mocking the downfall of Cedar Hollow's tyrants. My favorite was a cartoon rendering of Linda Bowman trying to mop up a lake with a single paper towel, wearing her prison jumpsuit and a look of sheer panic. I printed it out and pinned it to my refrigerator, a small, petty trophy that made me smile every time I walked by. But fate, as it often does, had even grander plans for poetic justice. Barely a week after the arrests, Cedar Hollow was hit by one of the worst storms the region had seen in 20 years. Rain hammered the parched ground, saturating it faster than the struggling, redirected storm drains could handle. Without the lake to act as a natural reservoir, the water had nowhere to go. It surged downhill, flooding streets, filling basements, and turning manicured lawns into brown, bubbling swamps. Houses along the former lakeshore, especially the newly constructed ones on the HOA side, suffered the worst. Foundations shifted, driveways cracked, mold bloomed in drywall like an unstoppable infection. Entire first floors had to be gutted and rebuilt. The same neighbors who had once muttered about me being a troublemaker now stared in horror at the consequences of their board's greed. Lawsuits blossomed like poisonous flowers after the storm. Insurance companies balked, citing the HOA's willful alteration of the natural landscape as a known hazard, voiding coverage. Homeowners, furious and desperate, turned on the remnants of the old board with a vengeance. The special assessments proposed to cover legal fees and damages were so astronomically high that entire streets organized legal actions to dissolve the HOA altogether. Meanwhile, on my side of the lake, things were moving in a very different direction. Once the federal and state authorities cleared my portion of the property and declared it free for restoration, I wasted no time. Working closely with environmental specialists, I secured the proper permits to legally reintroduce native aquatic species into the remains of the lake. Volunteers from nearby towns, environmental groups, and even some ashamed Cedar Hollow residents joined in the effort. We planted native watergrasses, repaired the natural shoreline, and carefully reintroduced healthy populations of speckled darters, small-toothed minnows, and sunfish. It was slow work, meticulous work, but it was healing work. Every splash of water returning to its rightful place felt like a stitch repairing a wound. The transformation was breathtaking. What had once been a barren, cracked pit began to shimmer with life again. Dragonflies hovered above the water, their jeweled wings catching the light. Frogs returned, croaking through the humid evenings. The gentle sound of water lapping against restored banks replaced the mechanical roar of pumps and the desperate shouts of ruined homeowners. It was as if the land itself was breathing again, grateful for the second chance. In the wake of Linda Bowman's disgrace and the storm's aftermath, Cedar Hollow held its first honest election in years. With most of the old guard either in jail, bankrupt, or too ashamed to show their faces, a new board rose from the ashes. This time, it was made up of people who actually lived here to enjoy the community, not to lord power over their neighbors. Harold became the new president, running unopposed. Elaine from 2 streets over took on the role of secretary. Even Mrs. Langston, who had once been too shy to raise her hand in meetings, was elected treasurer. Their first act as the new Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association was a unanimous vote to officially rename the lake on all neighborhood documents. It would no longer be referred to as the retention pond or the communal water feature. It would reclaim its true name, Cedar Hollow Lake. Their second act was even more symbolic. They commissioned a local artist, one of the same people who had volunteered to help restore the lake, to carve a memorial from a fallen cypress tree. The result was a stunning sculpture of a leaping fish, captured mid-arc, its scales intricately detailed, its mouth open in a permanent, joyous defiance. Beneath the fish, carved deeply into the base, were the words, "Respect the water." The memorial was placed at the lake's edge, where everyone could see it, a permanent reminder of what happens when pride and vanity try to fight against nature's patient, inevitable hand. The day the memorial was unveiled, the whole neighborhood gathered around the sparkling lake, families picnicking on the banks, children racing along the restored shoreline with bare feet and shrieking laughter. I stood a little apart, leaning against the hood of my truck, arms crossed, watching with a small, satisfied smile. Rebecca Hastings was there too, sipping lemonade and laughing with Harold about something I did not catch. Even the Fish and Wildlife agents, who had once combed the dried mud, now visited on weekends, fishing poles in hand, grinning like kids at Christmas. And me? I saved the best moment for myself. The next morning, as the sun climbed lazily over the horizon and bathed Cedar Hollow Lake in warm, golden light, I launched my battered old John boat from the dock once again. It creaked reassuringly under my weight as I pushed off, drifting gently out into the middle of the water. I poured myself a cup of coffee from my thermos, the steam curling into the cool morning air. The surface of the lake rippled with tiny waves, broken only by the occasional splash of a fish chasing breakfast. Dragonflies danced above the water, stitching silver threads in the sky. I leaned back in the boat, one hand trailing lazily through the cool water, and watched it all with a heart so full it hurt. Somewhere far behind me, the courthouse prepared for Linda Bowman's first pre-trial hearing, the charges stacked high against her, like a wall she would never climb over. Her empire was gone, her reputation was ruined, and her future held nothing but grim concrete walls and the endless ticking of institutional clocks. She would never set foot near this lake again, and even if she somehow escaped prison, the community would never forget. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest, and smiled. Not a big smile, not a gloating one, just a quiet, satisfied grin, because this lake was still here. The fish were still swimming, the dragonflies were still dancing, and for the first time in a long time, everything was exactly as it should be.